June 6, 1944. Sector Dog Green, Omaha Beach, Normandy. 6:35 hours. The ramp of the landing craft, vehicle, personnel, LCVP, slammed down into the freezing gray surf of the English Channel. Instantly, the air was filled with a sound that no training could prepare a man for. It was the sound of the German MG-42 machine gun, Hitler's buzzsaw, firing at 1,200 rounds per minute. It sounded like tearing canvas. Private First Class Jackson plunged into the water. It was up to his neck, cold as ice, and turning pink with the blood of the men who had been standing in front of him seconds ago. He was carrying 80 pounds of gear, rations, entrenching tool, ammo belt, gas mask. But his primary concern, the only thing keeping him tethered to sanity, was the 9.5-pound piece of walnut and parkerized steel gripped in his right hand. He hit the sand, crawling on his belly. The beach was a chaos of obstacles, steel hedgehogs, wooden stakes tipped with mines. To his left, he saw a soldier fumbling with a bolt-action 1903 Springfield sniper rifle. The man's hands were covered in wet sand. He fired a shot, reached for the bolt handle, and struggled to cycle it. The sand had jammed the action. A split second later, a German sniper's bullet found him. Jackson crawled behind a steel beam. Bullets sparked off the metal, showering him with rust and lead fragments. He looked up toward the bluffs. A German pillbox was sweeping the beach, its gunner traversing back and forth with mechanical precision. Jackson raised his rifle. He pressed his cheek against the wet wood of the stock. He looked through the peep sight. He didn't have to take his hand off the trigger. He didn't have to lift his head to work a bolt. He didn't have to break his sight picture. He simply pulled the trigger. Bang! The rifle bucked against his shoulder. The gas system cycled instantly, ejecting the spent brass casing into the sand and stripping a fresh round from the clip. Bang! The second shot followed a fraction of a second later. Asterisk bang. 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 Asterisk. Up on the bluff, the German machine gunner ducked. He was confused. He was used to fighting infantry. Infantry fired, then paused. Asterisk bang, click clack, bang. Asterisk that pause was the rhythm of war. That pause was when you killed them. But this American didn't pause. He kept firing. Asterisk bang. 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 Asterisk. Then came the sound. A distinct, high-pitched metallic ping that cut through the roar of the ocean and the explosions. The empty 8-round and block clip ejected from the receiver, spinning into the air. Before the sound had even faded, Jackson reached to his belt, grabbed a fresh clip, and shoved it down into the open action. The bolt slammed home with a mechanical crunch. He was back in the fight. To the German defenders on the Atlantic Wall, it felt like a magic trick. They were facing an army where every single rifleman seemed to possess the firepower of a light machine gun. They were being suppressed by sheer volume of fire. For centuries, the rhythm of infantry warfare had been defined by the bolt action. The majestic, slow, deliberate dance of manual reloading. The United States changed the rhythm. This is the story of the rifle, caliber .30, M1. The Garand. It was the weapon that General George S. Patton called the greatest battle implement ever devised. It was a marvel of industrial engineering that turned farm boys into fire teams and rendered the German military doctrine obsolete. The Germans mocked it. Their engineers called it an ammunition waster. They believed that a soldier who could fire 8 rounds without stopping would lack discipline. They believed in the precision of the bolt-action Mauser, a weapon of the 19th century. They were wrong. By the time they realized that volume of fire was the new king of the battlefield, their Wehrmacht was being bled white by a weapon they had dismissed as a toy for cowboys. This is the story of the wooden stock and the gas piston. The story of Garand thumb. The story of the ping heard round the world. This is the story of the M1 Garand. To understand the revolution of the M1, you have to understand the world it was born into. A world stuck in the past. In 1918, World War I ended. It was the war to end all wars, and it was fought with bolt-action rifles. The British had the short magazine Leonfield. The Germans had the Mauser Gur 98. The Americans had the 1903 Springfield. These were elegant weapons. They were beautifully machined. They were accurate at 1,000 yards. and they were painfully, fatally slow. In the mud of the trenches, where battles were fought at 50 yards, a bolt-action rifle was a liability. If you missed your first shot, you were likely dead before you could chamber a second one. After the war, every major military power looked at their stockpiles of millions of bolt-action rifles and said, good enough. The logic was simple: money. The Great Depression was looming. Budgets were slashed. Why spend millions developing a new rifle when you had warehouses full of perfectly good ones? Besides, the generals argued, a semi-automatic rifle, one that fires every time you pull the trigger without manual cycling, was impossible for a standard infantryman. It would be too heavy to carry. It would be too fragile for the mud. It would overheat and jam. And, most importantly to the penny-pinching logistics officers, it would encourage soldiers to waste ammunition. The prevailing doctrine was, one shot, one kill. They believed that if you gave a terrified 18-year-old a semi-automatic rifle, he would panic and fire all his ammo into the sky in 10 seconds, leaving him defenseless. So, the British stuck with the Enfield. The Russians stuck with the Mauser Nagant. The Germans refined their Mauser into the Kar 98K. Only one nation dared to think differently: the United States. And they did it because of one man: John Cantius Garand. Garand was not a general. He was not a West Point graduate. He was a French-Canadian immigrant who had left school at the age of 12 to work in a textile mill. He spoke English with a heavy accent. He was a born tinkerer, a machinist savant who spent his spare time designing motorcycles and ice skating in his living room to test new blade designs. In the 1920s, working at the government's Springfield Armory in Massachusetts, Garand became obsessed with a single mechanical problem: how to harness the wasted energy of a gunshot to load the next round. It sounds simple today, but in 1920, it was an engineering nightmare. When a .30-06 cartridge is fired, the pressure inside the chamber spikes to 50,000 pounds per square inch psi. It is a violent, contained explosion. To harness that violence without blowing the gun apart required a level of precision that didn't exist yet. If the bolt opened too early, the brass casing would rupture, exploding in the soldier's face. If it opened too late, the gun would jam. For 15 years, Garand worked. He lived in the armory. He designed the gun, but he also designed the machines that would build the gun. He was obsessed with mass production. He didn't want to build a prototype, he wanted to build a system. But he faced constant interference from the army bureaucracy. In the late 1920s, a group of ballistic experts decided that the .30-06 cartridge was too powerful for a semi-automatic rifle. They argued it generated too much heat and recoil. They wanted to switch the entire U.S. Army to a smaller, lighter round, the .276 Peterson. Garand was forced to redesign his entire rifle for this new, smaller bullet. He spent years perfecting the .276 Garand. It was a masterpiece. It held 10 rounds. It was light. It was smooth. Then, in 1932, General Douglas MacArthur, the Chief of Staff of the Army, stepped in. MacArthur looked at the budget. The U.S. Army had billions of rounds of .30-06 ammo left over from World War I. He looked at Garand and said, essentially, change it back. Garand was devastated. Years of work, scrapped. He had to go back to the drawing board and redesign the rifle again for the bigger, more violent .30-06 cartridge. Most engineers would have quit. Garand just went back to his workbench. Finally, in 1936, the Army adopted his masterpiece. It was designated the U.S. Rifle, caliber .30 M1. It was a gas-operated, semi-automatic rifle. It fed from an 8-round and block clip that inserted into the top of the action. When the last round was fired, the clip ejected with a distinctive metallic ping, and the bolt locked back, ready for the next one. But adoption was not acceptance. When the M1 began arriving in the hands of Marines and GIs in the late 1930s, they hated it. It was heavy, nearly 10 pounds fully loaded. It was complicated to clean compared to the simple Springfield. The early models had a gas trap system at the muzzle that was prone to falling off during bayonet practice. And then there was the Garand thumb. The M1's loading mechanism is aggressive. To load it, you push the clip down into the magazine. As soon as the clip clicks into place, the bolt automatically slams forward. If a soldier didn't keep the side of his hand against the charging handle to hold it back, the bolt would smash into his thumb with the force of a bear trap. It was a painful rite of passage that left thumbnails black and blue for weeks. Garand thumb became the secret handshake of the pre-war army. But the biggest criticism came from across the Atlantic. German intelligence officers examined the specs of the M1 Garand in 1939 and scoffed. Typical American engineering, a Luftwaffe technical report noted. Overcomplicated. Fragile. It will jam in the mud. It will freeze in the snow. A peasant soldier cannot maintain such a clockwork mechanism. The Germans prided themselves on the Mauser Kar 98K. It was a bolt-action rifle that had essentially remained unchanged since 1898. It was rugged. It was accurate. It was simple. The German infantry doctrine was built around the machine gun, the MG-34 and later the MG-42. The machine gun was the killer. The riflemen were just there to carry ammo for the machine gun and protect its flanks. They didn't need a semi-automatic rifle. The Americans had a different idea. They believed that every single rifleman should be a base of fire. In 1941, these two philosophies collided, and the world found out who was right. The first major test of the M1 Garand came not in the fields of Europe, but in the rotting jungles of the Pacific. And it wasn't a test of precision. It was a test of sheer stopping power against a terrifying enemy tactic. December 1941. The Japanese Imperial Army was sweeping across the Pacific. They were unstoppable. Their infantry doctrine relied on the Banzai charge. This was a massed frontal assault with bayonets, designed to overwhelm the enemy with courage and numbers. The Japanese believed in Seishin, spiritual power. They believed that the will of the warrior was stronger than American steel. Against British and colonial troops armed with bolt-action rifles, the Banzai charge was terrifyingly effective. A defender could fire one shot, cycle the bolt, and by the time he looked up, the Japanese soldier was 3 feet away with a bayonet. Then they met the U.S. Marines at Guadalcanal. August 21, 1942. The Battle of the Tenaru River. It was 3 o'clock hours. Pitch black. The Marines were dug in along the sandbar at the mouth of the river. They were tired. They were hungry. And they were scared. Colonel Kaineo Ichiki of the Japanese Army led 900 elite shock troops. He believed the Americans were soft. He believed one decisive charge would break their morale. At 3:10, a green flare went up. 900 Japanese soldiers rose from the jungle, screaming, "Banzai!" They charged across the sandbar, bayonets flashing in the moonlight. It was a human wave of steel. In 1918, this charge would have overrun the position. But the Marines in the foxholes raised their M1s. Private First Class John Rivers gripped his rifle. He didn't have to bolt it. He just pointed it at the mass of screaming shadows and squeezed the trigger. Asterisk bang. Ben, 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 ping, asterisk. Reload. 2 seconds. Asterisk bang. 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 Asterisk. The Japanese assault didn't break the line, it disintegrated. Japanese survivors later described a feeling of total confusion. They were used to counting the shots of the enemy. They knew the rhythm of a bolt-action rifle. Bang. Asterisk, there was a gap where you could run. There was a moment of safety. With the Garand, there was no gap. It was like running into a wall. One Japanese diary captured later read, "The fire never stopped. We couldn't get close. The Americans didn't reload. They just kept shooting." The Marines fired so fast that the wooden handguards of their rifles began to smoke and catch fire. They had to urinate on the barrels to cool them down. But the guns kept working. By dawn, Colonel Ichiki's regiment was destroyed. Nearly 800 Japanese dead lay on the sandbar. The Marines had lost fewer than 40 men. The M1 Garand had passed its first test. It proved that in the chaos of close-quarters combat, volume of fire was the only thing that mattered. But the jungle also revealed a quirk of the rifle that became a legend, the ping. There is a persistent myth in Hollywood movies and video games that the ping of the ejecting clip got soldiers killed. The theory goes that Japanese or German soldiers would wait to hear the ping, know the American was empty, and charge out to kill him while he reloaded. Veterans roll their eyes at this story. First, consider the noise of a battlefield. You have artillery exploding, machine guns firing, grenades detonating, and men screaming. The idea that a Japanese soldier could hear a tiny piece of sheet metal hitting the soft sand 50 yards away is absurd. Second, even if he did hear it, reloading an M1 takes less than 3 seconds. By the time an enemy soldier stood up to charge, the Marine would have a fresh clip in and would be waiting to shoot him. In fact, the ping became a psychological weapon for the Americans. Some wily sergeants reported using it as a trap. They would carry an empty clip in their pocket. During a lull in a firefight, they would throw the empty clip against their helmet or a rock to make the ping sound. Then they would raise their fully loaded rifle and wait. When a curious Japanese soldier popped his head up to take a look at the empty American, he caught a .30-06 round in the helmet. The Pacific proved the Garand worked in the mud, the sand, and the salt water. It proved it could stop a charge. But the real test of its dominance would be against the masters of infantry warfare, the Wehrmacht. November 1942. Operation Torch. The Americans land in North Africa. For the first time, German infantry faced the M1 Garand in large numbers. And the shock was immediate. German tactical doctrine relied on suppression. Their MG-42 machine gun would pin the enemy down, while their riflemen maneuvered to the flank. They assumed the American riflemen were just like them, armed with slow bolt-action Springfields. The first engagements were confusing for the Germans. A German squad would fire on an American patrol. They would expect the Americans to take cover and fire back slowly. Instead, the Americans would unleash a torrent of fire that felt like multiple machine guns. When the Germans tried to maneuver, they found that every single American soldier could suppress them. A captured letter from a German corporal in Tunisia, sent home to his wife in Hamburg, read, "The Americans are automatic. They do not stop firing. We lift our heads and the air is filled with bullets. They have a machine gun in every foxhole. It is impossible to move against them." This was the realization of John Garand's genius. It wasn't just a gun, it was a force multiplier. Let's look at the math of a squad-level engagement. A German infantry squad had 10 men. 1 had a machine gun, the MG-42, and 9 had bolt-action Kar 98 KS. The MG-42 was terrifying, firing 1,200 rounds per minute. But if you killed the machine gunner, the squad's firepower dropped by 90%. The 9 riflemen could only fire 10 to 15 rounds a minute each, and they had to stop aiming to reload. An American squad of 12 men had 12 M1 Garands, and usually 1 bar automatic rifle. Every single man with a Garand could fire 40 to 50 aimed rounds per minute. If you killed the bar gunner, the squad still had massive firepower. If you killed half the squad, the remaining 6 men could still put out more lead than a full German squad. The M1 allowed the Americans to use a tactic called walking fire. Because they didn't have to stop to work a bolt, American GIs could advance while firing from the hip or shoulder. They could suppress the enemy while moving. German doctrine required the riflemen to stop, kneel, cycle the bolt, and fire. This made them static targets. The Americans kept coming, firing as they walked, keeping the Germans' heads down until they were close enough to throw grenades. This advantage became critical in the hedgerows of Normandy in June 1944. The bocage country was a nightmare. Ancient earthen walls, topped with thick tangles of roots and trees, divided the fields into tiny fortresses. The Germans dug into them, setting up kill zones. Fighting in the hedgerows was a series of sudden, violent snapshots. A German helmet popping up for a second. A shadow moving in the leaves. A split-second target. In this environment, the split-second speed of the Garand was the difference between life and death. If a German soldier missed his first shot with a Kar 98K, he had to 1. Unshoulder the rifle. 2. Lift the bolt handle. 3. Pull it back to eject the shell. 4. Push it forward to strip a new round. 5. Lock the bolt down. 6. Reacquire the target. That process took about 2 to 3 seconds. In those 2 seconds, An American with a Garand could fire 3 rounds without ever losing his sight picture. The Germans called it Führerüberlegenheit, fire superiority. And they couldn't match it. By 1944, the German high command was in a panic. They realized their infantry was woefully undergunned. They scrambled to produce their own semi-automatic rifles. They created the Gür 41 G41, and later the Gür 43 G43. These rifles were disasters compared to the Garand. The G41 had a bizarre gas strap system at the muzzle that fouled constantly. It was heavy, unbalanced, and fragile. Soldiers hated it. They would often throw them away and pick up bolt-action Kar 98ks. The G43 was better, but German industry couldn't produce them in numbers. They relied on complex machined parts that required skilled labor Germany no longer had. While the Germans were hand-fitting parts in bombed-out factories, the United States was mass-producing perfection. This brings us to the industrial miracle behind the gun. Springfield Armory and Winchester Repeating Arms weren't just building rifles, they were building millions of them. John Garand had designed the rifle with interchangeability in mind. This was a uniquely American concept. In German manufacturing, parts were often hand-fitted to the specific gun. If a bolt broke on a Mauser, you couldn't just grab a bolt from another Mauser and expect it to fit. You needed a master armorer to file it down and check the head spacing. With the M1 Garand, the precision was built into the machines, not the men. A trigger group from a Winchester M1 made in 1943 would fit perfectly into a Springfield M1 made in 1945. A barrel from one gun could be swapped to another in the field. This meant that American logistics were incredibly efficient. If a part broke, you grabbed a spare from the supply truck and kept fighting. By the end of the war, the United States had produced over 4 million M1 Garands. The cost? About $85 per rifle. Roughly $1,400 in today's money. The result was that the U.S. was the only nation in World War II to equip its entire infantry force with a semi-automatic rifle. The British didn't do it. They stuck with the Enfield. The Russians had the SVT-40 but gave up on it because it was too complex for their conscripts. The Germans had the STG-44 assault rifle, arguably a better weapon, but it came too late, 1944, and in too few numbers, 400,000 versus 4 million Garands. Every GI, from the frontline infantryman to the cook to the truck driver, carried a weapon that was superior to 90% of the enemies he faced. The psychological impact on the German soldier was profound. Interrogation reports from 1944 and 1945 are filled with complaints about American firepower. One prisoner, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had fought the Russians for 2 years, told his American captors, "The Russians come in waves, but they are poorly armed. You Americans, you are lazy. You do not charge. You do not bayonet. You just sit there and burn up ammunition until there is nothing left alive in front of you. It is unfair." He called it unfair. That is the highest compliment a weapon can receive. But the M1 wasn't perfect. It had quirks that soldiers learned to live with, and sometimes die with. The N-block clip system meant you couldn't easily top off the magazine. If you fired 3 rounds and there was a lull in the fighting, you couldn't just shove 3 more bullets in. You had to eject the partial clip, which would fly out into the mud, and load a fresh one. This led to a habit among GIs of firing off the last few rounds into the dirt just to reload a full clip before moving. And then there was the rain and the cold. In the Battle of the Bulge, December 1944, temperatures dropped to 0. The oil used to lubricate the M1s turned into a sticky glue. Rifles began to jam. Soldiers had to improvise. They stripped the oil off their guns using gasoline stolen from jeeps. They ran the rifles dry, metal on metal, to keep them cycling. There are stories of soldiers urinating on the receivers of their rifles to thaw the frozen actions during the desperate defense of Bastogne. But even frozen, the M1 was robust. Its rotating bolt design, inspired by the locking lugs of artillery breeches, was incredibly strong. It could handle the highest pressure ammunition. It could be used as a club, a ladder rung, a crutch, and a hammer, and it would still hold 0. The legacy of the M1 Garand extends far beyond 1945. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, the M1 was called back into service. Once again, it faced human wave attacks, this time from the Chinese and North Koreans. In the frozen Chosin Reservoir, the M1 proved itself again. The ping echoed off the Korean hills just as it had off the French hedgerows. But by the 1950s, technology was moving on. The Soviets had developed the AK-47. The world was moving toward select-fire assault rifles with high-capacity detachable magazines. The 8-round clip of the Garand looked archaic. The US replaced the M1 with the M14 in 1957, which was essentially just an M1 Garand with a 20-round magazine and a selector switch. Then came the M16. But ask any veteran of World War II or Korea, and they will get a distant look in their eye when you mention the Garand. They won't talk about the weight. They won't talk about the thumb. They will talk about the feeling of security. It was like holding a piece of America, one veteran said. It was solid. It was honest. You knew that if you did your part, it would do its part. The Germans started the war mocking the cowboy gun. They ended the war terrified of the wall of fire. The bolt-action rifle was a weapon of the 19th century, a weapon of precision, patience, and conservation. The M1 Garand was the weapon of the 20th century, a weapon of volume, suppression, and industrial might. John Garand, the man who skated in his living room and never made a dime in royalties from his invention, gave the free world the tool it needed to destroy fascism. He died in 1974, relatively unknown to the public. But his legacy is buried in the soil of Iwo Jima, Omaha Beach, and Bastogne. It is written in the history of a war won not just by generals and strategies, but by the simple, mechanical advantage of 8 rounds, semi-automatic, as fast as you can pull the trigger. This is forgotten thunder. The weapons they laughed at. The stories they forgot.